Hello everybody, this is Luke, the editor of the podcast you're about to listen to. I'm just here with a quick little content warning before you jump in to let you know that because we're discussing Dracula and because of a lot of the historical context and interpretations of the book, there is a lot of discussion of sexual violence. There's also mentions of gore, blood, general violence, and some discussions of homophobia. So please take care of yourself, have a wonderful, safe Halloween, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to Lit Chat. This is our podcast for the Omega Phi chapter of Sigma Tau Delta, National English Fraternity, and my name is Chandler White.
Hi, I'm Cate Kurtz.
I'm Kallie Olson.
And today we are here to talk to you about Dracula and all of its deep and disturbing history, context, and themes. Now, naturally for the Halloween, the season of the spooks, we are here to discuss it on multiple levels involving both horror tropes and Gothic literature, but also some of the history and still relevant underlying context today.
Yeah,
that is pretty expansive.
It is actually pretty expansive. So Dracula is based on a couple of different individuals, the main one being Vlad the Impaler, who was a count back being supported by the Turks with the Ottoman Empire. It was a whole conundrum, but he was known for being a very ruthless ruler. The big thing he would do is he would impale people, which would then successfully drain them of their blood, which I think you could argue the impaling of the spikes mirrors the impaling of the fangs from a modern-day vampire, then draining the blood. But yeah, so a lot of it came from there. He was very much so into gruesome and horrific things and events. And then another individual is Elizabeth Bthory, who was a countess back in, I think, Bolivia. But she would kind of do the same thing. She was known for bathing in the blood of virgins to stay young. But she based hers off of Vlad the Impaler. So those kind of together started to influence the modern vampire tropes as they came about.
Yeah, just about all of which tend to originate from this work, which originally originated from folk tales, which kind of dated back to this ancient history of counts and countesses, and there is actually even a number of books, but one in particular named Carmilla, which predates even Dracula, kind of beginning the up curve of this formation of the modern vampire trope. And Bram Stoker, the author of the book, for context, it was published in 1898. Bram Stoker published it to really nobody's acclaim, and then promptly died of overwork, and then Nosferatu was made a movie out of it without buying the rights, which resulted in a lawsuit from Stoker's widow, but the lawsuit raised so much buzz about the book, that is why we know the name of Dracula rather than Nosferatu, and it gained
Have you
a
watched
fame of its
that?
own. I have watched Nosferatu very recently.
It's almost too much for Kallie.
Yeah.
In what way?
I just, like, his face, it's silent. His face is too much. I can't do it.
It is interestingly frightening in a variety of ways.
It is. It's, scary, but, also not at the same time, which makes it almost scarier.
Yeah. It's I guess the idea of the uncanny, which they say is, something familiar combined with something unfamiliar.
Right.
Something Dracula plays on pretty heavily, and also just the idea of the vampire in general.
So I do think Nosferatu, I really enjoy the film, for one, and I enjoy how it portrays vampires, because it's the very silent, creepiness. But we also have problems with it in my family, because I'm from a half Jewish, half Roman Catholic family, and that has a lot of anti-Semitic undertones in it, with Nosferatu having a larger nose, having a lot of money, and it was mirroring a lot of propaganda at the time. So, but I think that was just looking at the bastardization of the Dracula tale as it moved through the centuries, which is interesting because I feel like it reflects a lot of the sentiments circulating around at the time. It was either written or put out into the public through media.
Yeah, absolutely. And that as kind of a route into the vein of xenophobia, which is something that's often talked about when it comes to Dracula. frequently, and from the very start of it, when the novel begins with protagonist Jonathan Harker journeying up the mountain to go and tend to Count Dracula. He's a solicitor of dealing with homes. And from the beginning, Dracula is depicted as the very eastern force. He's kind of originates from Romania originally, and then there's a frequent depiction of him as being distinctly foreign. He has an aquiline nose that's mentioned like 60 times in the book. And he's constantly pressing forward into the west using Harker as a kind of a by route into the invasion of the west, which is why many people call it the beginning of invasion literature. Kind of this idea of fear of the other, something Dracula marks very, very iconically, both in ethnic or geographic terms, but also in sexuality, because the book Dracula, I would consider it the encyclopedia or Bible of perverted sexuality in Gothic literature. It really has every ounce of it in it, making for some very interesting moments.
And what's our favorite word in it? Am I gonna say it?
Yes, you are.
Am I gonna say it?
Yeah, you brought it up.
It's penetrate.
Oh my goodness.
Can that be the title of the whole thing? Just penetration.
Just all lowercase.
Literally nothing about Dracula.
Yeah.
They have to find that out later.
There's not even a thumbnail.
No, exactly.
Like a thumbnail, but it's all pixelated and blurry or something.
Oh my god.
Penetration is a huge part of Dracula. It kind of harkens back to Vlad in many ways.
Yes, because Vlad or however you want to pronounce it.
Clearly mine is the wrong way, I think it's...
We were in linguistics, come on. Yeah, penetration is definitely a big thing, because as being like the Impaler, they would penetrate individuals with spikes depending on the crimes they would do, and they would also change the regions to where those spikes would be placed depending on what the individual did. But that was just a big thing for him. It was definitely a source of power, and it was him showing like a domineering nature over his subjects, and he kind of ruled with an iron fist. He had this whole thing where, like, going a little off track, but just with him to show like the gruesomeness, is he wanted to rid the streets of his like kingdom or realm of beggars, because he thought that they were just capitalizing on the hard work of others. So he rounded all of them up into a palace of some kind, and they all had a feast and were happy about it. Then he bolted the doors and burned it to the ground, and that was his.
Lovely.
He's a great guy, like, really.
Where did he? I literally almost said, where did he penetrate them? Where did he impale them?
That's probably a better way to put it.
I don't think they were impaled primarily for the fact that, like, they were burned to death, but most people were impaled from, like, their anus and up through the mouth type of thing, like, just to be honest.
So, like, that just, that ties in completely with the whole sexuality.
Yeah, it's definitely a sexuality thing, because he's, like, emasculating the individuals.
Right.
As, like, a big thing with it. He'd also cut off their genitalia a lot. Like, that was... Because it was just showing a power of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was all the rage back then when it came to olden days where masculinity was... Admittedly, it was still invalidated in some ways, but it's not looked at the same way it is today. And back then, the idea of emasculating somebody or, using a blade as kind of a very phallic symbol of power or self-empowerment was all over the place. And it's all over the place in Dracula, too. Leading to some of the most disturbing and also some of my favorites scenes in literature of all time. Probably says something about how I pick my books. But there's a scene in particular with Lucy after she's been infected by Dracula. She's kind of become this vampire who terrifies the hell out of all these straight white Victorian men who are kind of just like rattling at the idea of a female actually being sexual and not just sexualized. Something that was not a thing back in those days, or if it was very taboo. And so in order to fix this, as any rational human would do, they basically confront her when she's sleeping in her grave, in her tomb, and apply a wooden stake directly into her heart. And what cements this as a penetration symbol, if nothing else does, the fact that Van Helsing says to her husband Arthur, "You are the one to do it. You're her husband. You should be the one to do this." And if that doesn't spell out, like, wedding night kind of penetration, purification, weird dynamic of that, I don't know what else would. But it always interests me, the fact that that was their way of purifying, and it's like the most grotesque thing in the book. Like, blood's going everywhere, and they're all looking at it like, this is beautiful. Like, it's the weirdest thing.
But, I mean, and that ties into, like, one of the biggest themes in it, which is, like, almost a switch in gender roles throughout, ever since Lucy, like, becomes a vampire, because she takes on more of a masculine role. Because she gets to penetrate people now instead of the men. And, yeah, so, like, what you said, like, she's actually just being sexual in nature at that point, and the only way for them to put her back in her women's role is to then, you know, stab her with a stake in the heart. So, I don't know. That's too much.
Jam that gender normality.
Jam the gender role back in. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, I mean, there are other times that there are switches, too, because, well, just like you said, the men are, like, freaking out because it's, like, they're being emasculated because they're being bitten. Mm-hmm. So that's another switch. What were we talking about earlier about when Dracula cuts himself, right? And then Mina is supposed to, like, suck his blood. Yeah. Which is a further implication of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely further inversion. I don't think you hit the nail on the head, hit the stake on the head. That really, no, but it is how it is. There's a scene later on in the book, one of the most, or at least the more iconic scenes from the book, where Jonathan Harker's wife, who Dracula really has emasculated from the very beginning, trapping him in a castle, leaving him to be feasted on by a bunch of female vampires who are equally as terrifying as Lucy was, manipulating him left and right, taking control of his wife, and finally basically breaking into their room, stripping open his, like, robe or whatever, slicing a gash in one of his pecs, and then applying Mina's face forcefully into it and having her basically lick up the blood, kind of with both physical force and also mental kind of mind control, something he's been known to do, which is both a reversal of gender roles, since it really ties in, like, every kind of disturbing dynamic there is, because it's like kind of like the mother feeding, like, milk to the newborn, but neither of those are what is happening. And then it's also, I saw it as very religious, because it almost resembles the Madonna of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus and that kind of thing. Definitely kind of takes everything the Victorians held special and just wrecks it in a very, very brutal fashion. Something I find enjoyable.
So we've already talked about a few other things like sexuality and the history, but I think it'd be kind of interesting if we could talk now about implications of, like, homosexuality in Dracula itself, as well as some, like, the historical themes that were, I don't know if they supported it or not, but...
Within the book, or, like, from the perspective of the author?
Well, do you want to talk about both?
Well, Bram, of course, never out loud spoke about the thing or anything. Generally, I sometimes get a vibe from Dracula that's kind of negative in that regard, but I think a lot of his feelings towards homosexuality come more so from a feud he actually had with Oscar Wilde, another Irish writer, who, between Bram and Stoker, they were kind of fighting over the woman who would eventually become Stoker's wife. And Oscar Wilde, later having come out and then promptly been in prison for being a homosexual, I think if there was some Victorian xenophobia living inside of Bram Stoker, it was in that regard, because I think some people have theorized that Dracula was modeled off of Oscar Wilde, and that may have been something that carried over. But there's no way to know for certain.
Mm-hmm. And we were discussing this, like, off the recording, but you said earlier something about Dracula himself possibly being gay or something like that. There
are certain scenes that kind of point to it. In the beginning, or near the beginning, whenever Jonathan first kind of discovers, oh shit, I'm in a vampire castle, and he sees what people have referred to as the brides, being these 3 vampire women who live inside of Dracula's castle with him. And they kind of rush towards him and are attempting to, seduce / vampirize him. And then Dracula appears and he waves him off and he says, I don't remember the exact words, but it's along the lines of, "This man is for me.
He's mine," type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very possessive.
Yeah, it was kind of a jealous thing. And she was saying, and then the brides even laugh and say, like, "You yourself never knew how to love." And he was like, "I can love as good as any of you," or something like that. And then also Dracula's relationship with Renfield, the asylum inmate, has certain undertones of it. For sure. Because Renfield all frequently talks about Dracula, both in religious terms, often referring to him as the master, constantly kind of bowing and revering, but also he shows a significant amount of jealousy towards Mina whenever Dracula's in the process of kind of trying to seduce her, as Renfield's kind of saying, like, "Am I not enough for you?" kind of thing, whereas Dracula's really just manipulating him.
Is there a reason why Renfield refers to him as, like, his master, or, like, in the term of master? Like, is there anything that indicates why that could be?
From what I remember, the idea, I guess, is just that Renfield kind of, weirdly enough, Dracula and Renfield never actually come into contact with one another until he's, like, already in love with him, pretty much. Renfield refers to him as a master, and I guess the idea is just that Dracula's influence has kind of transcended his mind. Because the asylum where Renfield stays is right next to Carfax, which is Dracula's London home that he's trying to set up. And so, through that close connection, Dracula's been known to infect minds. And I guess the idea is that he's infected Renfield's mind so much so to the point that Renfield thinks of him as this godlike figure. But it's all very theoretical. Renfield's one of the more ambiguous characters of the novel. Why do you ask?
I was just wondering. So this is like a previous, I haven't read Dracula, but I was kind of here as, like, the historical individual. But, like, hearing that, I almost look at Dracula just from, like, comics and different documentaries I've watched as vampires and characters like him as individuals who are giving into passion or desire. So, like, I was just wondering, so if that character was referring to him as, like, his master or something like that, I was almost wondering, is he putting this character on a pedestal because that character in Victorian England is, because that's a very strict society, by giving into those desires, it's giving him a place of, like, higher stature, because it's almost like he's above those rules and stipulations of the more strict society. But that could also be completely wrong. That was just what was mulling in my mind when you said that. But I'm also missing the context, so I don't...
Yeah, I don't think it's impossible. Yeah. I mean, Dracula turns Victorian tropes upside down at every turn, and they're terrified of him. And he even says something that asserts a kind of dominance whenever they're trying to approach him with crucifix. And he says, "You think to baffle me, you, with your pale faces all in a row like sheep in a butcher's. You shall be sorry yet, each one of you. My revenge has just begun. I spread it over centuries, and time is on my side. Your girls that you love are mine already, and through them you and others shall yet be mine." Which the whole pale faces in a row kind of also brought me back to an ethnic kind of mindset of, like, oh, that might be a call out to Victorian, like, racial uniformity. And also just his general persona of being from the East and being so frequently disrespectful of Victorian institutions.
So we've talked about some pretty serious things so far, so I thought to lighten the mood, I have gathered a collection of Dracula puns, and I would like to share them with the class. If you'd like to guess the answer, you can, though they are pretty intellectual puns. You might not be able to get it eventually. So we have, what's Dracula's family car called?
I don't know.
Wait for it. A mobile blood unit, but okay.
Mobile what?
Yeah, mobile blood unit. Like, you get it? Because the unit's a car. Okay, fine. We'll go to the next. No, it's fine. It's fine. No, because, well, I feel like you almost think of it like blood drives. They have, like, the blood unit, and it's okay. It's why.
It's okay.
What is Dracula's favorite flavor of ice cream? Vanilla. Okay, hold on. I have one last one to wrap up those pretty cool puns. Where does Dracula keep his savings?
I know the actual answer, but...
Wait, what is the actual answer?
The actual answer is in his bedroom, in his chamber.
Oh, that's actually interesting. I was going to say the blood bank.
That's okay. I wanted to say it, but I really didn't want to sound like I did. Never mind. Yes, blood bank.
Yeah. So great. And you know what? You know what kind of coffee Dracula drinks? Decaffeinated.
I love how you started that one as if it was like a casual comment, like, by the way, did you know what kind of coffee Dracula drinks?
I mean, I feel like puns are pretty casual of it. It's like the casual, it's a common man's joke, you know? Like, it's like a comedy special. It is like an independent comedy special, which I enjoy because Dracula, because like even though I didn't read it growing up, I knew a lot of people who did read it. Because I don't know, is the language pretty accessible, or is it one of those books you have to like follow along with your finger while you read it?
It's really not that easy. Like,
Really?
It is by no means accessible.
I also feel like I read it very easily. I mean,
Right.
I'm an English major and I'm like trained to do that, I guess. But I don't know. It's because it's written in what is the term for it when it's written through letters and stuff like that?
Epistolary.
Epistolary.
Very cool.
So yeah, I think that makes it easier to follow than if it was just, you know, like any other text written at the time.
Frankenstein, for example.
Frankenstein. Yeah, you know. But it's a lot to actually take in if you're trying to read it, especially under a time crunch, which is what I had to do.
Yeah, me too.
For Freaks and Monsters, best class ever.
I'm sure you did
Yeah,
great in it, but do you know why Dracula always
Oh
failed
my God.
his exams? This is why Dracula always failed his exams. He was too ghoul for school.
He's not even a ghoul.
He's not a ghoul.
All right, okay. You know what? No, I raised you this.
Oh, no.
Because
What?
in the very hit, about 5 years old, like 5 years past its popularity spike, dolls, which kind of surpassed Barbie, was the Monster High dolls. And one of them was named Dracula. And hold on.
You are not basing this
Let
off
me
of Monster
finish this,
High.
ma'am. Her name was Dracula, and she was a part of the cheerleading team, which spoke of themselves as ghouls. Now, I don't want to be an expert here and say they're experts, but they might be. So therefore, my joke was still valid under the constraints of Monster High, which arguably surpasses that of Barbie. I rest my case. Thank you.
Don't fight with me about Barbie. Okay.
Barbie's so good.
Let's end that
Okay.
aspect of the
Different
conversation. I'll
So, Halloween's pretty spooky, am I right? You gotta have a vampire Dracula coming in and says you can't do it. And Kate comes in with puns. It's good.
It is pretty
All the
good.
puns.
So, this
the
has been Lit
scariest.
Chat, the spookiest Lit Chat you've ever known, and you gotta have a happy Halloween. Go to
Exactly.
strangers' houses, take their things, run away in masks so they won't recognize your identity.
And have a safe and nice Halloween. Do not drink and drive. And you know what? If like a 13-year-old still wants to come to your door to get candy, totally give them candy. They probably put effort into their Halloween costume. I know I'm putting effort into my Halloween costume, though I am not going trick-or-treating, but the effort will still be present. Wait, on a side note, what are you guys going as for Halloween? Because I feel like that's like actually important.
I don't know.
Okay, never mind. And this has been our Lit Chat.
Bye.
But
Bye.